Thank you so much, everybody, for coming here, and for all of the people on Zoom. Welcome to today's program, talking about warehouse distribution centers and its impacts on our environment, health, and safety. We really hope that this will be an educational forum for all of you here and all of those people who are living, especially in the South Tacoma area, most impacted by the Bridge Industrial Warehouse Project, and are only just now learning about it. These distribution centers are showing up all over, and in fact, one of our speakers from Clean Mobility Collective will speak to what's happening worldwide. We have an amazing panel lineup. I'll introduce them to you, and then they'll have 5 to 7 minutes to share their history or knowledge of this project. Our first panelist, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. It's Sally Perkins. She's a business and management consultant, a community activist, and really one of the conversation's own loved members. And the next one is online. I don't know if you can go online. It's Michelle Mood. And Michelle Mood is a South Tacoma resident who's written several articles for the Tacoma Weekly, the TNT, and other news outlets. The next one is Dr. Annemarie Dooley. She's from Physicians for Social Responsibility. Then Judy Olsen from Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. Les Pogue Jr., a Hilltop resident who has researched and testified at Tacoma City Council and is a liberation influencer. And Victoria Leistman from the Clean Mobility Collective, a worldwide program to eliminate the harmful effects of vehicular traffic emissions.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm probably the generalist on the panel, and so I'll be speaking from my own experience, both as a consultant and then as a person who's worked on community issues for a long time in Tacoma. So as a consultant, I was the facilitator for the update of the 2006 version of the South Tacoma Groundwater Protection District regs. And so I had an opportunity to be introduced to that. Essentially, it's a land use overlay, a zoning overlay to protect the aquifers in South Tacoma. And I was struck by how important, and as I did that work, one of the joys of being a consultant is you get to learn about all the projects that you're working on. And so I had a chance to learn a lot there. Struck by how important the aquifers in South Tacoma are. Struck by the effort to protect them in a pretty large region. I mean, the Groundwater Protection District boundary comes all the way up to South 19th here in the Hilltop, so it's a big boundary. And the things I learned, I think, helped me understand what's happening with the warehouse project today. One is I worry that the people in power are not paying enough attention to the need for clean water. Yes, we have a good supply from the Green River. Yes, we've added filtration capacity there, which makes it even better. But I haven't seen any projections on Green River capacity for the future with climate change, or might happen with climate change in terms of how the South Tacoma aquifers could be recharged. So those are the kinds of things that are important to me, having learned about this process back when I facilitated those meetings. I wish more people in Tacoma thought about where their water came from and thought about what it meant to protect it and what our job as residents and community members is to help protect the water. And so I'm hoping that this conversation today and the conversations that you all will have with your neighbors and friends and family might expand the core group of people who understand why this is so important. It doesn't take a whole ton of people to make a critical mass, but it probably takes more than we have right now. So I guess, so that from my work perspective, that's the way I look at it. As a community person, I've lived in Hilltop, I think now for 26 years, and I served on the Central Neighborhood Council Board for 10 years, and we were constantly embroiled in land use hassles. And the takeaway from that is the land use code in Tacoma is intentionally Byzantine. It is designed to work for $600 an hour land use attorneys. It is not designed to work for community members. And so for community members to keep up and to actually be involved in those processes takes an incredible amount of time and effort. And if you don't have the $600 for the land use attorney, you're doing it on your own, which is not fun. Central Neighborhood Council pioneered Land Use 101, which was an effort to educate members of neighborhood councils and other interested community members on how Tacoma's land use process works. We did that collaboratively with the city, which was great. I'm not sure that is continuing, but if it's not, it should be brought back. It's really hard to see where the accountability is in a process like this for two reasons. One, there's virtually no discernible accountability, in my opinion, on the land use side, because even if conditions are placed on a project, the monitoring and enforcement piece is not strong. At least that's my experience, and the city might yell at me for saying that, but that's what I think, having watched it. Promises are made, but they're not kept. And when people raise concerns about why they weren't kept, there's just a lot of confusion about what happened and why, and that's problematic to me. The piece that's even more troubling to me is the way the responsibility is fragmented among multiple bureaucratic agencies. So the Department of Ecology might have a role, the Health Department might have a role, the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency might have a role, the City of Tacoma might have multiple roles, depending on the department. The Department of Transportation might have a role, and by the time they all get done swapping things around, it's like one of those games with the shell and there's a thing and you're supposed to follow and figure out where it is. Community members, again, are faced with having to build a giant matrix of how to track everything and hopefully figure out what's going on. And so the conclusion I draw from that is that that's a bureaucratic-friendly process, but it's not a community-friendly process. It should be an integrated process that community members can participate in, regardless of who the bureaucratic agencies are. And so one of the things that I would love to see people advocate for, and the Bridge Warehouse project is a great example of that, the LNG plant is another great example of that, is to advocate for processes that impact whole communities to be integrated in a way that communities can understand all the impacts and that the people responsible for regulating those impacts are answerable to the community. Right now, that's virtually impossible, again, unless you have hours and hours and hours of time to devote to the process. So I'll stop. I'm eager to hear from the other panelists to learn more about this specific project, and I hope that we're all energized at the end of today to go out and work on these topics even more energetically in the community. Thank you.
Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I was taking so many notes during Sally's presentation. I wish I had known that. I was completely ignorant, but I will say that that's been my lived experience, is what she has described. My property is right next to the proposed construction. My backyard looks out over it. When we got the permit notice that there was going to be this mega warehouse, I knew nothing about any of this, and we had a short period of time to give comments, and I did as much research as I could. And as Barb has said, I've published some blogs since, but I have no formal training in this at all. To bring you up to date, the city went ahead last week and improved the mega warehouse permit and is allowing it to go forward without requiring an environmental impact statement or a health impact statement. How? It's because the city planning department decided that any effect of this warehouse, any effect on the environment that it could have, can be mitigated so successfully that there will be no significant environmental impact. And that's what the city says, even though these buildings are as big as 45 football fields, and then they are paving another 70 football fields worth of roads, parking lots, loading docks, all of this on top of the aquifer you just heard about, which has 4 wetlands and a stream that's going to be moved. It feeds salmon-bearing creeks and on to the Puget Sound. And of course, in the area of the city that already has the worst air quality and the shortest life expectancy, and is the poorest and the least white. So today I'm going to talk about 2 points. First, the serious problems with the technical plans for the warehouse, and second, the problems of the permitting process and how it disempowers residents and blocks even the city's own plans for an environmentally just, healthy, and sustainable Tacoma. It's not going to be as with as much perspective as Sally's. It'll be my lived experience. I'm actually a professor of political science, so I use some of my understanding of politics abroad to help understand it. And let me just say, if you have additional specific questions, I might know the answer because I've done a lot of reading. And so feel free to ask during the Q&A. And I'll also put a link in the chat where you can find out more information about the mega warehouse and actions to take. And links, as I understand it, are on the flyers on the action paper table, on the action table for those who are in person. Okay, first, the serious problems with the technical aspects of this warehouse. The corporation that bought the land, Bridge Industrial, hired consultants to prepare all the materials needed for the permit process. So like the survey of the wetlands, the stormwater runoff, the survey of the impact on the traffic and air quality. But neither Bridge Industrial nor those hired consultants really has any incentive to do a good job with these materials. And on the other hand, the city has no experts to double check that work. And in fact, the permit materials were really shoddy work from beginning to end. The pre-approval materials were mostly from a 2008 warehouse that had been permitted but not built. The next 3 submissions were almost exactly the same materials. They would just change the date on top. And there were glaring errors and omissions that even I, as a non-specialist, could see. What's sad and frustrating is that even when I or others went ahead and found independent experts, the city ignored them. Last fall, for example, a retired hydrophysicist looked at the stormwater and aquifer hydrology of the permit. Sorry, I was stumbling over hydrology because I don't really know these words. This hydrophysicist, which I also had never heard of, said there was a whole bunch of information and data listed, hundreds of pages. And then the conclusion, and he could tell, actually, the conclusion was unrelated to all of those hundreds of pages of information. And the city has known this. And this seems to be the plan of action for much of this material. The city accepted without question when the proposal suddenly reduced the expected number of new vehicles on our roads every day from over 8,000, yes, 8,000 every day, to under 5,000. And then a warehouse of this size, 2.5 million square feet, can generate as many as 11 to 12,000 new vehicle trips a day. Whether 5,000 or 12,000, I mean, you know our roadways can't take it. For the traffic impact assessment, the city prevented the study of the routes used to access 16 and I-5 and the port area. I don't know why. And then the air quality used this flawed traffic study to say what would the impact be on the air, and didn't include any of the impacts of the routes up to 16 or I-5 or the port, nor the impact of idling while waiting at all the red lights on the way. Lastly, looking at the wetlands materials, I found a wetland expert who said it used outdated science to evaluate the health of the wetlands and used disproven claims about how to improve the health of wetlands. And again, the data didn't follow from the material and was all kind of jumbled up, like they had just had to throw something together. The reason the wetland report is so important is because in last week's permit decision, the main reason the city listed for this construction to be permitted, despite its locations near this critical biodiversity area, is that the wetlands function is supposedly going to be improved by the builders cleaning it up. That this is in the public interest to have the wetlands function be improved. And so it's in our public interest, the permit should be improved, but that's exactly what the science does not support. And I told them back last April 22 that that was the case. So overall, the city went ahead and approved this permit without having sound science and did it without requiring an environmental impact statement, which would have served as a check on any possible overlooked effects. And they also, despite this being placed in an area of high environmental health inequity, did not require a health impact assessment. So this leads us to my second point, the political process. The city says it used an expanded notification process to let city residents know and comment on the proposed warehouse. Expanded notification legally should be all the residents 10 blocks away. But I think it actually went to about 2 blocks because my neighbors 5 blocks away didn't get it. I still have a question in about that. But in total, fewer than 1,000 people received a notice about the planned mega warehouse last year. That in no way represents the people who will be directly impacted by the warehouse. My zip code alone has 22,000 people. just in the immediate area. And of course, all of Tacoma will be impacted by the traffic, but none of the other city neighborhood councils got a permit notice except for the South Tacoma Neighborhood Council. And they got it just when the rest of us did, which was more than a year after the permitting process had already been in the works. That's right. The city was working with Bridge Industrial in late 2020 and only let the South Tacoma Neighborhood Council know February 2022. At the level of the city council and the mayor's office, I have never gotten anyone to respond to any of my emails or phone calls. Shockingly, one city council member told a citizen he had a gag order on the warehouse. Someone at the city was literally preventing our own representatives from talking about the warehouse permit with us. In fact, this is my opinion, the city manager seems to be grooming our elected representatives to ignore all development issues. Last summer, City Manager Polly gave a presentation to the City Council about the land use permit process. And there was a lovely flow chart of the process. And in that flow chart, there was no option for any input from the council, no mention of an environmental impact statement, no mention of a health impact statement, and no possibility for a permit to be denied. And that's the vision of the unelected city bureaucrat. I think they hold all the cards. Council does have a role. They are not powerless. But if they are fed information that denies their role in their agency, they are made powerless. In the final permit approval material last week, Planning Department Director Peter Huffman never addressed any citizen concerns. He even ignored concerns from the State Department of Ecology, the Department of Health, the US EPA Region 10, all of which asked for a health impact assessment. And I got to tell you, Bridge Industrial did not respond to any citizen concerns, which they are required to do. All of this can change. The city has a role in oversight of the bureaucrats, and it can make ordinances to ensure our health and safety. Of course, that's their role. They make tons of lovely resolutions about anti-racist systems transformations and climate action plans. But it doesn't, if it doesn't pass ordinances to force decisions to be anti-racist and sustainable, the old systems continue. Yeah. And of course, we citizens have a role. The more of us get involved, the more power we have, as Sally said. It takes a lot. Citizen action does matter, and the city may have thought they could put this mega warehouse in the poorest neighborhood, assuming we don't have the resources and time to participate. We can prove them wrong. Please check out the action table to get the links with details, or follow the links I'll post in the chat. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
So this journalist was asking me about air pollution and who seemed obsessed with my title and, what my qualifications were. And, I think anybody in this room, as we've just heard, who's interested in a project and lives locally can speak about air pollution in their neighborhood. But I am a practicing doctor. I did my training at the University of Washington, and as part of that training, I did a master's at the School of Public Health and Epidemiology. And the reason I did that, it wasn't because I really wanted to do research and I did publish studies, but because I wanted to understand data, particularly medical data, when it was presented to me, particularly data that related to this project, such as an air quality study that was passed off as data. I spoke to hundreds of middle school students last week, and I think 8th graders could have done a better job on an air quality study than that was done here. They could have told you that using air quality monitoring stations 30 to 40 miles away were not a valid comparison for ambient air quality in Tacoma. The people who wrote this air quality study said, well, it's just too hard to calculate ambient air quality in Tacoma. That's like me doing a blood pressure study of people in a building and saying, well, it's too hard to actually take blood pressures because, people are drinking coffee, they're stressed, so why don't I just do an average of the blood pressure in the building? And that's basically what this air quality was. They also used data from 2018, 2019, and 2020. Any researcher who knows what they're doing would not use 2020. As we all know, the first year of the pandemic was not a typical year for air quality. So getting back to the health aspects of this project, I think every project should be looked at through a health lens. You already heard some of them. In fact, where do I start? There's so many health impacts. You heard about water. I have to sign off, not for the Green River, on the water quality of the Tolt River every year because it feeds water into my dialysis unit. And I have seen when the city of Bellevue forgets and doesn't inform us about something that they change. And I've heard alarms going off in the dialysis unit as tanks drain water. So what the city does with its water in this aquifer is very important. I'm not sure if the dialysis units in South Tacoma know about this project. And you've also heard of something called a health impact assessment, which is very, very important. And most of you probably haven't heard of what a health impact assessment. Even the Tacoma Pierce County Department of Health have recommended that a health impact assessment be done on major projects in Tacoma. What it is that you actually use local data and local input. If local input from people and data wasn't used, then no health impact assessment was done here. You have to look, and particularly I'm focused on diesel air pollution, on what is the magnitude of the effect that all this new diesel pollution is going to have. Who is going to be affected? What diseases are you looking at, from asthma, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and my specialty, which is kidneys and high blood pressure, which are also linked to diesel air pollution. All of these things, who is going to be affected? How many cases are you going to see from all these diesel vehicles that are going to be passing through neighborhoods? This is just one aspect of a health impact assessment that should be done and was not done. Health impact assessments are relatively new, but we absolutely need one on this project. Now, I really believe, and I'm going to say it, is that the policy by the City of Tacoma on this project, given the burden on this community in South Tacoma already of diesel pollution, is racist. Their policy here of approving a project is racist. And I'm going to say that again, their policy is racist by lumping on a community already suffering from diesel pollution another project that will, I know for sure, raise more cases of asthma. There'll be more people on medications. There will be more hospital visits. There will be more and deaths. And it's not enough for the city and Bridge Industrial to look only at the economic and engineering costs of this project. They have to look at the health costs. And those health costs will be externalized on the community. And they will never be featured in any proposal that you will see. So in the end, we need a health assessment study done on this project. It can take 1 to 2 years to do a health assessment and study, and a real one, not just some bogus air quality study and some noise pollution studies, which were all done based on ideal conditions. So we need a health assessment before this project, even though it's been approved, is allowed to be started. Thank you.
So I'm the program manager of the Social, Economic, and Environmental Conditions for Health at Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. That program includes our healthy housing work, air quality, climate change, as well as social, emotional, economic supports that we have for families in the Pierce County area through family resource centers and our communities of focus. So some of you may be familiar with the strategy that we call communities of focus. That's where we have identified 6 areas in Pierce County where we know we have greater health inequities, we have lower life expectancies than neighboring zip codes, and primarily due to historic racism, due to environmental injustice in the neighborhoods. And one of those 6 neighborhoods is South Tacoma. So this project really stood out to us when we heard about it because, again, the idea behind prioritizing our communities of focus is to try and right some of those wrongs and have a health equity approach in those neighborhoods. So a project of this size has a number of different health considerations that we looked at. And I'll just kind of give you the bucket areas that we considered, and you can see in our expert agency response letter that's part of the public record, there were some pretty specific recommendations in each of these areas. These recommendations were not from a health impact assessment, and I'll address that in just a minute, but just to give you kind of, again, those broad buckets of concern. One is the impact on climate change. We already know that climate change is impacting both environmental and human health, and we know that a project of this size will have implications for greenhouse gases and further issues for climate change, not just in that South Tacoma neighborhood, right? Climate change doesn't obey boundaries and neighborhood lines. But quite a few recommendations we made related to the city's own climate action plan. And then one of the other issues is air quality. That's a really big one. In addition to asthma, air pollutants, that particulate matter, PM 2.5, you may hear talked about, that comes off of those diesel trucks, has really significant cardiovascular effects, as well as impacting people who have diabetes and other chronic health conditions. But we see an increase in stroke and heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, they call them MIs, but essentially heart attacks that are happening when folks are exposed to too much of that PM 2.5. And so the air pollution has a number of health concerns attached to it, any air pollution, right, whether it's wood smoke or coming off a diesel truck. And then the other area would be heat islands. This is an area that would have, somebody mentioned the equivalent football fields of pavement. And we know Tacoma, if you've all been here the last few summers, you know we've had some crazy heat that we didn't used to have. And so there's a concern about, that's an area that has pretty low tree canopy cover. And so it's not shaded well. All of that pavement absorbs the heat. And then right around 9 o'clock at night in the evenings, as the rest of the area starts to cool, neighborhoods that have a lot of pavement actually heat back up. You'll notice the temperatures increase in the evening from like 9 p.m. to midnight or so. And it makes it really hard for families to cool off their homes unless they're able to stay awake until, 1 or 2 in the morning and open their windows then. So heat island effect is really a big concern for us as we learn to live in our new climate. There's an idea of what's called placemaking, and that's when there is a big project like this, how do you get significant input from the neighborhoods so that it builds a sense of place, so that there's improvements to a neighborhood? And that would be something going beyond mitigation of harms, but really adding some benefit. How can we add some benefit when there are projects? Traffic injury prevention is a big concern with all of those trucks. I forgot to mention this with the air quality, but some of the routes that they showed go past some elementary schools and child cares, and so we think about the added air pollution burden there around those vulnerable groups, as well as increased concerns in traffic and pedestrian safety. So those are some of the big bucket areas. South Tacoma Groundwater Protection District, we don't have a role there until the user of the facility is identified. And then we have a role if they are doing activities that might have certain pollutants that could get into the water. But for the actual construction, we don't have a role during that. What else? Noise and light, that's the last one. Lots of noise during construction, noise if trucks are driving overnight. Sorry, I need a drink. And lights, if anybody's lived somewhere with the big, places lit up overnight next to your house, it can be a challenge and interrupt sleep. So those are the big buckets that we talked about. We requested a health impact assessment. The city agreed that that would be a good idea, but it didn't happen, and there's a couple of reasons. There's how a SEPA works is they will identify whether a project needs an environmental impact statement. So that's really looking at things like those critical areas, the wetlands, what are those environment impacts? And it may seem strange, but a human health impact assessment is not required. It's not part of SEPA. There's no requirement for one of those actually anywhere in the state. It's a somewhat new tool, but by new I mean 15 or 20 years ago. These really came out and were starting to be used across the country. But prior to that, we didn't even have a tool like that at all. So there's a need way upstream, maybe at the state level or the county level, or I don't know what that level will be, but at some point the ideal world would require consideration of both. Does a project need an environmental impact statement, and does a project need a health impact assessment? So without that requirement or law, if a health impact assessment is done, it has no teeth. Somebody mentioned it can take 1 year to 2 years to do a really good, thorough health impact assessment. And they can be very expensive. A full health impact assessment can run around $30,000 to $50,000. And then there's currently no mechanism that would require a developer or agency to follow the recommendations that came out of a health impact assessment. It doesn't mean it's not something to do. It's a really great tool if, for example, it's a planning process that the city were going through. There's been other conversations in the South Tacoma neighborhood around perhaps having a green economic zone in the future. So a large zoning conversation like that where the city is on board saying, yes, health department will do a health impact assessment with you, and then we'll take those recommendations and put them into our planning process. But when they're working with a private developer, they believe they are legally constrained from taking information from a health impact assessment and forcing a developer to make those changes. So they're limited to the SEPA and the EIS, mitigated determination of non-significance or determination of non-significance. Sort of 3 options that the city has when they get these project proposals. And I may not have laid that out really linear, so we'll have time with questions and answers for me to try and clarify if that was confusing. The health department has only ever participated in one health impact assessment. It's new to us, but we have a partnership with State Department of Health, and we are trying to develop a model program. And so this is a space we're moving into. We do have capacity now to support health impact assessments, if not to conduct the whole thing, to contract for them, or to help a city or county to scope and say what should be in your health impact assessment. So we over the last 6 months have been building some capacity, and we expect that to continue to grow. So it's a new space for us, but I think it's long needed. I think we need to be protecting human health as much as the environmental health. They are both equally important in my mind, but we need to have a mechanism that requires both of those to be considered.
How's it going, folks? There's a lot of seriousness in the space right now. I know there's a lot of information in here. I appreciate the opportunity from the conversation to be up here speaking about this project and its effect on the folks, all the people of Tacoma and whoever drives on I-5 or Highway 16. When I was listening earlier, I just want to say, sometimes they ask me about diversity when I speak on panel discussions, and this is what shows up. So when we talk about the complaints about folks not being present, this is what we get. These are the folks that show up to represent at city council meetings, at county council meetings, at Tacoma school board meetings. You get what shows up and the outcomes from that, or the lack of what shows up. And I was going to title this Politics and Pander, Another Bamboozling, because that's what's going on through the city of Tacoma. City of Tacoma was awarded the lead SEPA agency again. They did the same thing with the LNG factory, that they want to ship all this toxicity out of the city. The expansion of the report requires this type of industrial warehouse infrastructure. But if you look at the data that's out there, there is so much vacant industrial warehouse space. Pierce County, King County, all of us have it. The effects, after city council promotes systems transformation, healing the heart of Tacoma, they're making it pedestrian friendly, yet you okay the building of a 2.5 million square foot industrial warehouse. And you've been planning this for a while. And when you show up and speak to the governance, they hear what they hear. They hear the frustration of years of not being listened to. So we get called, extremists. We get called, just rabble-rousers, or so many derogatory names that I've heard from city workers, from city representatives, you know? And it's frustrating when we're dealing with that type of hostility, when we bring all of this science, all of this data. You know, we haven't even gotten justice for Manny Ellis yet, you know, and we're sitting up here trying to fight another warehouse, because some of y'all might not be aware of the big old ice cube sitting out there in South Tacoma. That was put in, and through testimony of the public, because when people show up, we get to hear their stories. We learned about the effects of that building on the west side of Tacoma and UP. When summer hits and those refrigerators turn on, they cannot sleep at night because they're so loud. So when we talk about the effects of projects like this on the entire Pierce County, the city of Tacoma, it's not just limited to the 1,000 people that were made aware of what was going to be built in, you know, okay. It's not pristine down there. That is not a pristine area. It has over 100 years of pollution from the Burlington Northern Shipping and Freight Railroad Company. Over 100 years. There were 3 smelters there. When we talk about a Sarco, this area had 3 smelters on that land. So when public testimony comes up, folks that live in South Tacoma, they talk about when they have to shut their windows through the hot summer and the dust that collects on the windows. That is that settlement of 100 years of industrial pollution there. There's a Superfund site at this place. It is, whatever they say, encapsulated right now, but it sits right over the aquifer. So they're going to disrupt all of that toxicity. They say they're going to encapsulate the Superfund site, but when you got I do development. I've built for over 38 years. I know how the land is moved around. I know what's stirred up when you start digging 20-foot deep, you know, footings for a foundation of a building, when you have tractors out. So all that dust is going to be disrupted again, and the lack of proper air quality research won't pick that up, you know? So when we talk about systems transformation and the city's claims, this is not systems transformation. Transformation would have been you denying this industrial, you know, madness. It's madness. You know, and the further bamboozling of the public when we're told at one city meeting, they said the attorney could not speak about the bridge industrial project. And they were supposed to strike that project from the verbiage on the dais. And they did it. We asked our city council representatives, Keith Blocker, I'm District 3 in the Hilltop, what's going on? No response. I think Bushnell is the only city council member that I've ever heard say anything about this project openly because he was concerned for his people there. But that was it. So when we talk about gag orders, when we talk about bamboozling, politics, you know, this is the perfect example because they know folks don't show up in Tacoma. It's a blue-collar town. They want to keep it gritty, keep it shitty. You know, that's what it is. And it sucks, you know? So show up. You know, the effects of COVID on public participation in governance is striking right now. It is. They have 25-minute city council meetings because 7 people show up. Before COVID, there were 200 people going to city council meetings. They were in session till 10:30 at night. I get off work at 5 o'clock. They have public comment the first part of the meeting, so who's supposed to say anything? You know, we used to have 3 minutes of testimony. Now we have 90 seconds. It's nuts. It's the insanity of the mental illness of white supremacy. That's what it is. It's capitalism. The consumption, that's all it feeds. But I'll end with that.
Hey, all. It's good to be here. It's nice to see some familiar faces from the LNG fight, although, of course, it's sad circumstances that yet another giant, hugely polluting facility has been sited here in Tacoma. I'm now working for the Clean Mobility Collective, which is a new international network that's working to address the public health and emissions crisis in the transport sector. I am the US and Canada coordinator for the network, and we also work in Europe, India, and are expanding into Southeast Asia. And you know, it's funny just to have the last note end on overconsumption, because when we look at the rise of transportation emissions, there was this really big exponential increase in it when the start of the COVID-19 pandemic started, which of course makes sense with the boon of online shopping. And so a lot of that was justified. People were home and needed to be getting materials to their doorsteps when it was scary to go out. But online shopping rose, it tripled globally between 2014 and 2019. And that's before the pandemic started, right? And so this is a huge increase in, you know, not only emissions, but also in local pollution, driving, more waste, and in effect, delivery companies are starting to really consolidate and have a lot of more political and social power than we had previously seen. And so the US is now the second biggest consumer market in the world, and its global share of e-commerce is projected to grow to 1.3 trillion by 2025. And this growth comes at the expense of communities that are already bearing the brunt of environmental and air quality impacts, specifically from the last mile delivery supply chain, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. And you know, the communities most impacted, not surprisingly, as we've heard already, are low-income communities of color. And that's where these fulfillment centers and these warehouses are being located. And so again, it's not a surprise that we see one of these facilities sited where it is in South Tacoma. In particular, Clean Mobility Collective's partner Consumer Reports found in 2021 that Amazon, in particular, opens most of its warehouses with a disproportionately high number of people of color. And nationally, this is in the end of 2021, 69% of Amazon's warehouses had a greater share of people of color living within a mile radius of comparable neighborhoods. And you know, a lot of these communities are, again, not only already heavily impacted by poor air quality, but by noise, traffic, diminishing road quality, et cetera. And so, again, just to emphasize too that this isn't an isolated scenario. This is a pattern that we're seeing happen. I have the amazing opportunity to work with people now in Southern California, in Chicago, in Brooklyn, where these facilities are opening up in huge, huge numbers and at huge scale, and we're seeing similar patterns about who's being impacted. And so to go back to last mile delivery, which to my understanding is what the Bridge Industrial Project will be serving, it's this final stage of a package's life cycle from where it's produced to when it finally reaches a doorstep. And it's not always actually just 1 mile. It can be multiple miles, but it's that last step of the journey. But despite it being just the last mile of the journey, globally, it accounts for up to half of all emissions from a delivery cycle. So what that means, right, is that maybe a bunch of packages were on one big truck and then another big truck, and some of these, which are also highly polluting, but then they go out to a distribution and they go out in multiple smaller trucks that have much more, are having disproportionate effects on pollution in the communities where people live. And so the Clean Mobility Collective, we have an overarching goal of getting to zero emission deliveries by 2030, and we have 2 theories of change on how to do that. One being a corporate campaign, so how are we moving companies like Amazon to make better commitments, and then also policies, right? So what some of the other speakers were talking to earlier, how can we create more accountability with our decision makers and actually put policies in place that will make sure that the impacts of these types of facilities are being accounted for. A good example of this, right, is San Francisco. The Teamsters, for example, there, worked with a diverse coalition to get a moratorium on new warehouses passed. which would then require a conditional use permit that's being developed, I believe still now, on what type of facilities can be built and what type of provisions need to be built around that. So for example, right, if a new warehouse is going to go in, all of the vehicles going in and out of there have to be electric, and all of the equipment being operated as electric is just one example. And there's a lot of policies that are being developed across the U.S. right now because, again, this is a pattern that we're seeing in a lot of different communities. On the corporate front, so we don't know right yet who will be operating this facility. And Amazon, I would imagine, is a contender. It could be somebody else also. But we, as the Clean Mobility Collective, are launching a global campaign the week of May 21st, actually, called Deliver Change, which will be trying to get a commitment from the company for zero emissions last mile delivery by 2030. And, you know, we've previously released a couple of reports on last mile delivery, and we looked at how a number of major global brands stacked up proportionately. And because of some of that research, of course, on how, at least especially in the US, how Amazon's facilities are disproportionately cited in low-income communities of color, but also for a number of other reasons, including that, you know, the company has the ability to set precedent for how other delivery companies and how other warehousing and how the whole logistics supply chain could be shifting. And we are here in Tacoma in Amazon's headquarters, back neighborhood, and have a really good opportunity to be able to move the company. And so we're going to be releasing more information later this month too, in a new report on criteria pollutants and how the company, what type of trends we're seeing globally, and how the company is emitting these types of pollutants. We already have some on carbon dioxide emissions, but it'll be more health-related impacts. And you know, we have a huge opportunity, like I said, to move the company. They have a current commitment right now of net zero emissions by 2040, and they are saying they want 50% of their last mile deliveries to be zero emission by then, which is just absolutely insufficient. We need that 2030 commitment, and especially for last mile delivery vehicles, the technology is there in order to change these vehicles. And we're also, you know, trying to make sure that we are asking for zero emission deliveries, not just zero emission fleets. So that we're seeing things where, especially in denser neighborhoods, we're investing more in wider bike lanes where bike deliveries can be done with e-cargo bikes or parcel pickups or these other mechanisms, so that we're not just also relying on a car-centric culture when we know we need to be improving our cities to be better places for us all to be able to move around. The last little bit that I want to touch on also is just, you know, I think there's a lot of talk when a new facility like this opens around jobs, which is just such a tired old narrative around how we are pitting jobs versus the environment. And at least Amazon and a lot of these giant warehouse operators are facing huge criticism for how they're treating their warehouse workers and delivery drivers. You know, when we started to really dig into what the landscape of last mile delivery is and what we could find out about the emissions, so much of it is a black box because of the subcontracting culture. And so these companies subcontract out drivers, and then a lot of times those subcontractors contract out more folks. And then it's just, you know, someone in their car who's doing deliveries. And the burden of transitioning cannot be on those people, right? We have to make sure that the companies are accountable to paying for zero emission vehicles and for making these changes. And, you know, it's just the driver misclassification is just a huge problem, and it's something we just have a huge opportunity again in the campaign that we're developing to have that integrated into our demand set and make sure that we're seeing true accountability for how these companies are left on the hook. And so I welcome everyone here to participate. It's a very exciting campaign launch. It's called Amazon Deliver Change. The week of action is starting May 21st, and we have folks participating in India, in Europe, in a lot of different places. And so we have a lot of exciting momentum. And again, it's the opportunity for us to set precedent for the logistics industry. And there's also a lot of opportunity to build solidarity with communities that are also looking at the impacts of what these companies are doing and trying to fight for something better. So thanks for the opportunity.